He wasn't married when he bought it. He wasn't married when he sold it. Why does she have to be involved? There's a homestead issue. She was married to him at one point in time, during the time that they owned the property. She still has to sign off. So that's why it's important to ask a few more questions when you're going through the listing and we're talking to your buyers. It's not as important. I mean, obviously, the lender's delving into all that too, but especially with the sellers, because there's nothing worse than trying to get a signature from an ex-wife or an ex-husband that might not be the most reasonable person.
That's why I brought that up. We
Yeah.
had that situation. It was not a good divorce.
It's,
Oh
yeah,
my God.
they're not always, you know,
She
yeah.
didn't want to sign anything.
Yeah, and understandably they get wary after going through that.
It
So
took us about a week of negotiating with her, trying to go before she finally agreed to come in.
yeah, it was some coaxing for sure. So anyway, just something to be aware of, okay? So we're going to go through the rest of this. The last Schedule D is disclosure. So this is the one part, if we had, at the time that you had filled out the contract, we had the contract with the loan amount and the purchase price. Some of the fees will show down here, but it's not all the fees, it's just the policy numbers only. So if someone's looking at that and thinking that's all the fees that show up on there, that's not going to be the case. You're definitely still going to get a net sheet from us, and we'll kind of get you close to a ballpark of what the fees actually are. But that just shows policy rates on there when that's pulled. So that's just the typical legal disclosures, you know, arbitration,
So
Texas
usually
title.
What I tell the realtors, and what usually the realtors do, is whenever they get the title commitment in, the first things that they look at is Schedule A and Schedule C. And then, of course, there's a lot of things in Schedule C. The escrow officer typically will make a phone call.
Yeah.
Again, I'll let you guys be aware of what's going on.
And we are proactive. We'll be calling you, and we'll say, okay, I don't know if you had a chance to look at this, but this popped up. I mean, that's why you do want someone on your team that's going to be looking at that stuff. And because we don't, I mean, that's our job to clean that stuff up. We don't expect you to have to be on top of all that all the time. But you do want to at least be aware of it so you're not hidden. A lot of times your clients get those because that's the only thing they have going on. And they're, you know, excited to get anything about the transaction, and then they're calling you right away, and you don't want to get blindsided. You know, what's this? So it's just a good habit to get into to check all that right away so that you are the consummate professional when you're talking to your clients.
Now, could you open title like if you took a listing early in the game to see if there's issues and problems?
You know, what we recommend, because we get charged when you do that, anytime you open, just like, you know, because we have to do search and stuff like that. So if you do have one where you think, gosh, I'm not sure if there's some, you know, some errors that might pop up, or I'm not sure if they probated this, or those are definitely ones you probably do want to open up on. But the average one, Scott can pull a report for you. He can tell you what's on it, who owns it, that kind of thing. The average one, you really don't need to do the open title work right up the bat. But yeah, definitely if you have one where it is a little different, or you might have some questions on it and you're not sure if things might have been popped up on it, definitely it's probably a good idea to open up title early. So, oh, don't worry about it. You betcha. Thank you. So this next form, oh sure, go ahead.
It's always an arm wrestling match between the lister's agent and the buyer's agent, whose title company is going to be used.
Yes, yes.
And one of the listing agent ploys is to say, well, I've already opened title.
Right.
Okay, and so then you feel guilty.
Obligated, right.
Obligated. So if I'm representing the buyer and I want you guys to do the title work, what's the appropriate response to that?
Here's my recommendation, because I actually came from a state where it was seller directed, and I never agreed to that. I never agreed with that, I should say, because the buyer's getting the policy, and then the sellers were directing the title work to the really cheapy title insurance companies, because that's what they were paying for. And why do they care if the product is crappy? Because they're not getting the product. They just want the price. So here's my recommendation for that, is you remind the listing agent that the policy, you feel comfortable using a reputable company that you're comfortable with. This is who you're comfortable with, because the policy is the buyer's policy, and this is where they want the policy to go through.
And according to RESPA, it is the buyer's choice.
It really is the buyer's
Is
choice.
it according to RESPA?
Yes.
I did not know that.
But they could throw back to you, then the buyer will pay for it.
Right.
So just be aware of that.
Well, then the seller will pay for it.
No, they could throw back that if the buyer really, really wants to use it, then the buyer can pay for it.
Tell your
It
buyer.
says it's a customary thing for the seller to pay, it's not really.
It is customary for seller to pay, but it's not set in stone. Yeah, and if your buyer, I have had buyers that feel so strongly about it that they have paid for it. They're like, I want to use First American. I don't care if I have to pay for it or not. So you know, you're going to see that come through. But for you, for negotiation purposes, that say, you know, they've worked with them for years. They've used that same closer personally, they really would feel a lot more comfortable if it could go through them. So, because that's the policy they are comfortable with that policy with that backing.
Okay,
So,
can I ask you one more?
of
This
course.
is what would be like. I'll specify First American. And they'll say, okay, all right, but we're gonna use the First American office on I-10.
And-
Clear Lake.
and
Does it matter to you guys?
As long as we have the file sent to our office, we can send out for the signing somewhere else. It does matter as far as the premiums, yes, definitely, and as far as how we get paid.
It does, but here's just customer service wise. If the home is over in Katy or wherever.
Sure. Yeah.
Just go, and we encourage that because people typically live in the area that they work. And so
Sure.
if they have any questions about the area, that escrow officer.
Can answer. So especially if it's really far away, if you're
But if it's
weird
up in
county,
Conroe or Spring,
yeah, somewhere pretty close.
15, 20-minute drive, that's, we
Y'all
like
can
to
transfer those things.
Yeah, we can have courtesy signings. Yeah, within the metro area.
I've got a lot of realtors that do work in Conroe, Lake Conroe, and Willis. Well, they like the way we work, so we'll facilitate the closing, and we'll just sign their people up at our Conroe branch.
You guys will travel up?
It's only
It's not that
20
far.
minutes.
Yeah. So, yeah, because the end experience is for your clients. You want your clients to have a happy, fun experience and
Right.
for it to be as painless as possible. So we definitely are very aware of that and make sure that that's happening. But you also want it for you too. You don't want to have to worry about, want to give it to your team member and just let it go, not have to worry about it. And that's why it's important to have the escrow officer. You'll learn too that that's a huge relationship. You can just send a contract and not worry about it after that. You're going to get called and that kind of thing.
That's a great question, though. I get it all the time. And there's title companies out there that always tell their realtors, hey, put us on that. We don't. Our customers say, hey, we put you on MLS. Oh, that's great. But we don't really encourage it because we know, according to RESPA, as a buyer's agent.
Yeah. It's their choice. So this next form, this is the form that will have the sellers or buyers, sometimes it's the buyers that pop up on the title work, complete if we've noticed a judgment or a lien or something like that. So when we were looking at that title work earlier, the IRS lien, the abstract of judgment, this is what we'd need them to complete. So if we do call you, the reason why I'm pointing this out is a lot of times, and understandably, people are so worried about privacy and ID theft and that kind of thing. We'll call you and say, okay, we've sent something out to your purchaser or your seller. Would you mind calling them, letting them know it's okay to give it to us? It's okay to talk to us. Just because it asks all sorts of things, date of birth, social security number, residence. I mean, it's pretty in-depth because we've got to delve in to make sure it's not that person. So this is definitely a very private document. So that's why I wanted to point that out. But that's what we use to clear up the judgments and the liens and all that kind of stuff. And then again, if it ends up being them, then like Scott said, sometimes it's better for them to try to negotiate that rather than us. Yeah, exactly. So you'll see this come out with title work too. This is a tax certificate. These are really hard to read if you're not familiar with them, but it basically shows the taxes due on the property. So if you look at the kind of about a quarter of the way down, it says summary of all accounts. And it'll say base tax, and if you go all the way down, that 304530. So that shows what the property taxes are currently running, and that includes all of the districts, so all of the different districts. If you flip to the second page, you can see all the different taxing districts. So it's got Montgomery County, and it's got the forest, and ISD districts, and hospital districts, and all that kind of stuff. It's going through what the different districts gets with this particular property, what they paid out. Page 3 continues on. It's got mud taxes too. It's going on and on. Not yet. We'll touch on that. We can do that now while we're thinking about it. So with the homestead, this is perfect time to talk about this because it's talking about taxes. How the homesteads work is that if it's a person's primary residence, then they're able to fill out a form for the appraisal district. And then they would want to claim it as the homestead so that they get a lower tax base. It lowers the property taxes.
They have to own or live in the home on January 1st.
As of January 1st. So this is what will happen is that any time after January 1st that you're closing, they have to wait until the next year. It's a good thing to do as a realtor at the first of that, keep a list of your clients that have closed throughout the year. and then send them a little reminder email in January saying, just wanted to remind you to file your homestead exemption. And we'll talk about that too. He's going to go on to it. So we've got a tool which we'll go through, but for ones that don't close through First American. Reminder to file your homestead exemption. So what'll happen is then they file that with the county, and then the county will lower their tax base if they qualify for the homestead exemption. If the current seller had filed a homestead exemption, like the seller that they just purchased the home from, it does carry over through the end of the year. If the certain seller did not file it, it does not carry. They have to pay the higher taxes through at the end of the year. So it's something when you're looking at that to maybe go on the county websites just so you're aware of that, you know, when you go to closing, you're not unpleasantly surprised.
What is the rate of?
I believe it's a little bit less in Montgomery, a little bit more in Harris. I think one's 10 and the other one's 15.
15%. Does it just apply to the county taxes, or is it across the board on your?
It's across the board.
On your mud and your everything?
Yeah.
So 10 to 15% is a typical for the metro area?
Correct. Yes. Yes. And it varies slightly by county. Harris gets a little bit more, I know. So they're a little bit less on the total. And then the very last page here, it's talking about the HOA certificate. So this is, I'm going to touch on this too because we're going to see this more and more and more. But this is talking about the HOAs that we're aware of that have pulled up on the property. So hopefully your seller has told you if there is one. You know, this is talking about that there is one, in this case, Roman Forest Civic Association. And it's got their phone number and who you call. And then what we'll do is we'll order a fee letter or a status letter from them, and they'll tell us what any transfer fees are, if there's any back dues from the seller, if the seller's paid or due, and what the amounts are. And that's what we use to prorate at the closing. We are seeing more and more homeowners associations go to online servicers, and this is why I'm going to touch on this because this is going to be coming up more and more and more, where the homeowners association will not send us a status letter or send us a fee letter until someone pays online via credit card up front for the payment. That's why that document that I was going through on the contract earlier, the HOA disclosure, that's why that's really important that that's completed, because that document directs us to who we call for the upfront payment. We have to have the status letter, have to have it come in. We can't close without it. So that means that either the buyer or seller has to call them and order it online. We'll usually get it all set up and send them a link, but then they have to pay for it with their credit card. It's non-refundable. If the closing doesn't go through, they still have to pay for the status letter. So that's why I wanted to point that out, because you're going to see that more and more often. So just something to be aware of. It's
Define status letter.
It's like the fee letter. So again, it's a letter that we order from the homeowners association, and it'll tell us if the seller's current on their dues or if they're delinquent. It'll tell us what the dues are, and it'll tell us what they need from the buyers, like if they want us to collect some dues up front, and it'll tell us of any transfer fees for the management company.
Does
And
it
then
disclose if there's pending litigation?
that it's supposed to disclose, but it's not a guarantee that they will. That depends on the management company and the association themselves.
And that could be kind of expensive sometimes.
The status letter or the litigation? Yeah, it can be. Some of them are really pricey and some are not.
What are they? 150?
Right now, here's the thing too. Right now, most of them are running about 200, sometimes more, as long as you order, I know, as long as, and that's not the transfer fee. This is just to get the status letter. It's a separate fee.
Just wait for them to get money.
Yeah, and that's only if you order it at least 10 business days prior to the closing. If you have a rush, they consider a rush 10 business days or less, it doubles. It doubles to 400, and a lot of them are like that. So that's something that if we've sent you an email or if we've given you a call and say, okay, you know, the contract says the seller has to pay for that, or the contract says the buyers have to, I've set up a link, make sure the buyer goes and does that. Make sure they do it right away. You know, obviously if you don't want to do it if the contract's not going through.
Yeah, there's been times where we've been proactive. Hey, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this.
And they didn't
then
do
they
it.
have to pay $400, and we're like, we've been telling you this for 20 days.
Yeah. So just, if you get that, if your client gets that, make sure they do it right away and send it in, because then they're going to pay double if they don't. So then what we'll do is when we get the transaction is, I'm going to go through these two sheets here. Whenever you have a buyer with First American, you're going to see this buyer information sent to them, and there's usually a little video and stuff. It's actually a pretty cool little thing that they get from us. We do ask that they complete that, because basically, anytime that they do this stuff for us, it eliminates phone calls. It eliminates phone calls to us. It eliminates phone calls to you. Everything gets done. It's processed smoothly. So when you have a buyer, let them know that this will be coming and to fill it out and get it back to us. And it's just particulars, marital status, things like that. Sellers have one too. The sellers is a little bit more intense and in-depth because we have tax forms that are sent to them as well. Main reason why we send them the tax forms up front, well, I'll go through this. It'll go through their, this is their authorization. It's got wire instructions on there for their proceeds. They have to go through a lot of things on here. Questions about Social Security numbers, make sure they put that on there. It doesn't help us if it's not completed. Their existing loans, who it's with, the loan number, all that kind of stuff is all filled out. Page 2 is their authorization for us to, we do need this completed as well. Most payoff lenders now want the written authorization, so it's important that they fill that out again so that we don't have to make another phone call or delay the closing trying to get that in. The next form is the W-9 form. This is the tax reporting form. Each seller needs to fill this out, so if you have 2 sellers, both sellers will need to fill that out. This is why, the reason why I'm pointing this out is if you have a non-U.S. citizen that does not have a Social Security number, that is a big red flag for us. There's quite a few things that we have to do title-wise. It's called foreign interest property transfers. We may have to take 10% of the purchase price. That could definitely affect your transaction. Yeah, it's because they're not U.S. citizens, so they're not filing tax returns. As U.S. citizens, when we sell our house, we're paying taxes on the house. When non-U.S. citizens are selling the houses, there's no way to recoup the income tax unless we collect the FERPTA, and then it basically forces them to file a U.S. tax return.
You're escrowing 10%.
Yeah, well, we actually don't even escrow. We send it into the IRS, and then the seller gets to duke it out with the IRS.
Yeah, I've actually got an attorney who's going to be doing a workshop on the 25th at Grotto's. He's going to be talking about all of this and ways to how to work around it.
And there are a lot of foreign nationals in Texas, so it's just something to be aware of. It's not a bad question to go through when you go through your listing with sellers. Buyers, it's not as important. It's when they go to sell. So definitely want to make sure that if you are aware that you have a non-U.S. citizen, you're going through this documentation with them and letting us know right away so we can get through what your options are with your sellers. So the form after that, this is a non-reporting form. You're going to see this filled out, and it's always nice if the sellers can fill that out. Again, each one is filled out for each seller, so if you have a married couple, each one will fill this out. But it's basically a certification for non-reporting. So that means if they can basically say true to all of these items, that means that we wouldn't have to report their sale to the IRS. I do want to point out during these tax forms when the sellers might be calling you, I would not recommend in any way, shape, or form to go through these with your sellers. You're not tax attorneys. We're not tax attorneys. Never get yourself to the point where you're giving tax advice. If they have any questions, they can call us, but we can't give them tax advice. We would be telling them, if you have any questions on this form, you really need to consult with a CPA or a qualified tax attorney. So anyway, because you'll get a lot of people asking you questions. Again, I would just recommend that they it's not really hard. Read through the questions, say true or false, and then just sign it. It's not rocket science, but you definitely don't want to get to the point where you're giving your clients tax advice in any way, shape, or form, because it will come back to bite you. Well, she said, and then this last one is also dealing with basically non-foreign. The sellers are on this form certifying that they are U.S. citizens. So again, if you have a non-U.S. citizen, they would not be able to sign this document. It would be another red flag that you have some work to deal with us, and we'll start working on that with you. But this is where they verify that they are U.S. citizens selling the property. So that's it on the tax forms.
And I'll go over the survey. So just real quick, just things that we look for in a survey. Let's pull out this one right here, because there's some issues on this one.
Which one is that? Oh, yeah.
Okay, so if you're looking at the survey, you can see where the driveway is and where the garage. And in the front of the property, you see that there's a 20-foot drainage utility sidewalk easement. There's one of those easements. That's normal. Then on the right of the property, you can see there's a 75 or 7.5 foot drainage utility easement. That's normal. Everything looks good. You see where the building line is on the front of the property, 50-foot building line. That looks good. You're going to have sidewalks and driveways encroached. That's normal. But look at the back. Look at the back of the property. you see that there's a concrete pool deck. However, look at that easement. It's a 5-foot easement, 20 feet in the air. 5 foot wide, starts at 20 feet in the air. Okay, so that's okay.
Mhm.
But look at the pool house.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost 25 feet. So 5 feet of that is encroaching into the aerial easement.
See, it's 24, see how the measurement's on it?
So, the reason why I pointed that out, we would take exception to that, just like the 32 feet encroaching on the other guy's property on Schedule B,
Mhm.
on Schedule B.
So if it didn't have a pool house, it'd be okay.
Okay.
Right.
The aerial easement, you're saying that the
20 feet up.
location of the pool house was too high?
Yes.
Yeah, so it was over 20 feet.
Because it's 24?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So that 4 point some feet are encroaching onto the aerial
I just wanted
easement.
to point that out. I saw that on the survey, and that's why I confused.
And some people see that and they don't care. They're fine with it. They want the house. They don't see any issues with it. But it's just something to be aware of and point out.
And if that's a utility easement, which it normally is, the worst case scenario, if they've got to come in and do major work or dig up everything,
They-
you lose your pool house.
Yeah, if they got to go in, that's what I tell people, you know, if there's an easement for utilities, it's a use easement, so if you see someone out there going in there, you have to let them in. You can't get out there with your rifle and say, hey, get off my property, because they have the right to use that property for utilities.
So that's really what I wanted to point out in the survey. So if you use a pre-existing survey, please look at it. Just don't.
I don't think I would even notice it. I mean, I can see,
Well,
the building of the pool house, is that what you're talking about there, or not the actual elevation?
And you wouldn't know it until you got the survey.
Stated on there.
Mhm.
Yeah, right there. It says 5-foot easement, 20 feet off the ground.
yeah.
See it 5 by 20.
Yeah, okay.
The next is the T47. This usually goes with the pre-existing survey. Would you go ahead and talk about that?
So what will happen is if you are, either side, if you have a seller that's using the existing survey and you reviewed it and the buyer seems fine with that, then you want to make sure that the seller side, and we take care of this at the title company too, but a lot of people sometimes want to see this up front. The seller would sign the T47 affidavit, and this is basically where the seller's saying that they have not had work done to the property, work that changed the footprint of the property, so they haven't built onto the property. I don't mean like getting a new kitchen done or something like that, since the time that they purchased the home. And so item number 3, see where it's circled? That should say none. If they put something in there, chances are you're gonna need a new survey. So if they've said they've done any kind of work, added a pool, added a shed, typically that's going to call for a new survey that's going to be pulled. So just so you know that.
But if it's a wood deck, something removable,
Yeah.
we're okay.
That's not as big of an issue.
So I would encourage you guys, when you take a listing, if the seller has an existing survey, get a copy of the survey, get them to sign the T47.
You can get blanks and just.
It's available to all of us
Mhm.
as well through our zip forms. And then put that in your listing booklet that you leave in the home, so that any buyers coming through the home can see that there is a survey in a T47.
Yeah, right off the bat. Do the HUD next?
Yes, do the HUD.
Okay, so I'm not gonna, we're tighter.
Can we wrap by
I was
1:30?
gonna
Yes.
say, yeah, we
Yep.
can. I was gonna say we were gonna need to do that too, but we're closing. So I'm gonna go through this pretty quickly with you. But basically the HUD settlement statement, you're just gonna wanna check some big picture things. You're gonna wanna check things like the purchase price, the earnest money. This is nice that they did this. This is a really confusing document if you're not familiar with the document. Certain sections are credit sections and certain sections are charge sections. So a lot of people see something in the credit section and think they're being charged, and vice versa. So you have to be familiar with what the section is if it's a credit section or a charge section. So again, first page of the HUD, on the left-hand side, it's the buyers. It'll show in the charge section, it'll show things like purchase prices, settlement fees. We'll go through that in a moment. It'll total up the charges, and then it goes into the credit sections. It shows things like loan amounts, seller credits, earnest money, option fees, seller paid costs, title insurance. You'll see it's a little confusing the way that the HUDs are. you have to charge the buyer for title insurance on page 2, and then they get a credit back for the title insurance on page 1. Really confusing, but that's the way RESPA wants it, so that's the way that settlement statements have to be. So you're gonna see that as a credit on there too. Credits for taxes. I'll point this out because this is really confusing. Our taxes in Texas for this year won't be due until the end of this year. So this time of year, you're going to see a credit from the seller, a credit to the buyer, and a charge to the seller from January 1st through the day of closing as a proration for the 2014 taxes, because the buyer's lender or the buyer will be responsible for paying them at the end of the year. So that's why this is usually a credit to the buyer and a charge to the seller, regardless if they said, oh, I just paid that. They just paid 2013, we're now into 2014. We need to prorate for this year, due at the end of this year. So it'll total up all the credits, and then the difference between the two. Always be really careful about this, especially when you're looking at this from both sides. It'll say cash from or to, cash from or to. Be really careful, especially on the seller side, that you're looking at the to and from, because sometimes people see that and just assume it's cash going back to the seller, and it's cash from the seller. So be looking at that, okay? So sellers is the same thing. It'll just show the charges and the credits. Page 2 is the fees that get broken down. So on the buyer's side, you'll see the things like in the 800 section, all the loan fees, the interest, the mortgage insurance. You'll look into the reserves in the 1,000 section, the title insurance in the 11 and 1,200 sections are the recording fees, and 1,300s are all the miscellaneous fees. So you want to go through this. I mean, the loan fees you won't know as well because, you know, that's between the buyer and the lender on their good faith estimate. What you need to check are things maybe toward the bottom in the 1,300 section for the buyer. Make sure their home warranty's on there. Make sure if they ordered a survey that that's on there. And then I would recommend as an agent that you always look in the 700 section and make sure that your commissions are correct. This is where your commissions show. So this is what we understand at the title company the commissions to be, or what we've been represented as the commission. So check that and make sure that we have those percentages right, or you know, that kind of thing. So seller side is obviously on the right-hand side, so it will show commissions, closing fees, various recording and title fees, and then any home warranties and that kind of thing. It'll total up the seller's costs. So you see those numbers at the very bottom, the 92 figure and the 17 figure there. If you go to page 1, those figures show up on page 1. So on the buyer side, you can see the 9278 right there, right underneath in the charge section. In the sellers, it's a little bit further down. It's in the charge section further down, about halfway through the page, that 17 figure. So these are where those fees show up on the first page to reconcile the numbers.
So typically in the closing, you go over page 2 first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But as the agents, that's what you're looking for, the big picture things, the purchase price, the option fees, the earnest money, your commissions, that's what you're looking for in checking. You know, the loan fees, the buyers are a little bit more familiar with that with their good faith estimate. So are there any questions on the HUD specifically that maybe you're confused about, or you're gonna have to get used to it, I'm sure, from doing them from time to time, but looking at this form, is there anything you're confused about, have questions on?
And we have a HUD class that we go into detail, and we'll actually show you how to create a HUD. We've got a program that allows you to do that too.
Yeah.
So.
But yeah, especially for the first few transactions until you get really familiar with the form, you definitely want to at least glance through it as much as possible. I would recommend really going through them a lot on your first view. But familiarizing yourself with the form itself, so you know where things should be, where they should be popping up, and making sure that what was on the contract is on the settlement statement. Look for things like seller paid costs. Look for things like purchase prices, and again, your commissions that they went and check for too. So, and the warranties, another big one. Alrighty. So as far as the marital status affidavit, this is this kind of self-explanatory. This is what we have folks fill out if their marital status has changed since the time that they sold the property. So if they've gotten married, divorced, whatever, we have them fill that out. Pretty self-explanatory. Not saying name, person affidavit, so if we've gone through the check, they filled out that little form for us and they've completed it, but there might be something, maybe it's the amount that the lien is, or there might be something that just was a little bit, we weren't sure about. We might have them sign a not saying name affidavit. And we would just do that at the closing, but that's just your client, your buyer or seller verifying that they're not the same person that's showing up on that lien or judgment or whatever on the title statement. The next one's the warranty deed. So this is the biggie. This is the deed that actually conveys the title from the purchaser, the seller to the purchasers. So these are prepared by Texas attorneys. We typically, on a cash deal, we'll have our attorney prepare them, or if you have a loan, typically the buyer's lender, their attorney prepares it. But it shows the facts of the transaction as far as it'll show a loan amount where a non-disclosure states. So you'll never see the purchase price on here, but it'll at least show the loan amount if there is a loan. And it's really important that the properties are always showing up and the dates will be completed. But this is what conveys the property. It gets electronically recorded in the county, and then your buyer will get a copy of this after it's been recorded. We always get copies of the completed document at closing as well, but.
So I have a question for you. I
Of
know we're
course.
non-disclosure, but we can go into the MLS and pull sold data. How does that work?
It's, the reason why I say that is because of the taxing. So especially if you have someone filling out their homestead affidavit,
Yes.
they actually ask you things like purchase price and stuff like that. You might want to let your clients know not to fill out the purchase price. They're not required to put the purchase price on there.
Okay.
So, and in fact, when I had sent mine in, I whited out on my warranty deed, I
Yes.
whited out the amount of my loan before I sent my deed in to the
Because then it
county.
becomes a matter of public record.
Exactly. I mean, not that they probably couldn't pull that anyway if they were, wanted to go online and figure that out, but it's, it's just something to, you try to keep your taxes low, you try to not disclose things like purchase prices, then all of a sudden you're paying higher taxes.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what I would recommend is not sharing that with the county if they don't need to.
And in Texas, there is never a physical deed, right? It's just the registration.
Well, this is the deed. This is
Okay.
the actual deed. So this is
Okay.
the deed that puts the buyer into title, and they have the original. But it gets a county, it is a public record.
Right.
So for some reason, it's not the end of the world if they lose it or something happens to it, it gets destroyed. It is recorded, so
Okay.
it's a public record. So, yeah, they don't have to physically give the deed back to us for us to do anything else afterwards. It's already of records we can pull, but it was recorded and go off the county records.
Okay, and then you pay off the home.
Yeah,
Good.
that's this, we'll go through that, that's this
Alright.
deed of trust,
Yeah.
so that's like the mortgage or the security instrument. So you'll see here, in fact, here's the note, you'll see the note next. We're gonna skip that for a second, we're gonna go to the deed of trust. So this is the lien, the deed of trust is the lien. So you'll hear two different deeds. One's the deed that puts the buyer into title, and that's the warranty deed. And then the deed of trust, this is the deed that secures the lender's interest. This is the collateral deed for the lender. So this gets recorded against the property as collateral until the loan's been paid off in full, and then it's released from the property records. So this is the security instrument for the lender.
And then do you get anything as a homeowner?
As a homeowner, typically now these go directly to the county to be recorded, because what was happening is the lenders would send it to the homeowner, and the homeowner didn't know what to do with it, and it never got released. So typically now the lenders send the release paperwork directly to the county to get released. But yeah, as a homeowner, you're supposed to eventually get that release paperwork in. That's always a good thing to keep a copy of.
Okay, great.
But yes, and it's supposed to go through that process. So that's the deed of trust. So the notes next. As a buyer's agent, really, a lot of these things, privacy reasons, you're not really involved in the loan process, but it is important that you understand the note. It'll show, you can see it's circled here, it's got the loan amount, the lender's name, the interest rate is circled. And in the US, payments are always due on the first day of the month, usually begins not the month after closing, but the month after that. So say if you're closing like this month in February, the first mortgage payment will be on April, because we collect interest in March 1st, and then the payments start on April 1st. Interest is always 1 month in arrears. So they catch up to March interest-wise, and then payments start in April. And where you're gonna run into this, you're gonna see this as a question a lot from your sellers, is on the payoff. I'm just gonna touch on this because it comes up all the time. So on the payoff, when we order a payoff statement from the lender, from Wells Fargo, basically, whatever, you get a statement every month as a seller or as an owner, and I'll say, okay, this is your principal balance. Principal balance is not the payoff. Principal balance is the principal on the loan. Because you didn't make a mortgage payment, your first mortgage payment until April 1st, the payoff is where they catch up with you. They catch up with you on the back end. So that's why I always remind sellers is, you have interest due, because interest is 1 month in arrears. Do you remember when you refinanced or when you closed on your house, you didn't have a mortgage payment for over a month? This is where they catch up with you. It's on the back end. No such
Wasn't
thing
a
as a free
gift.
lunch. They catch up with you somewhere. So always remember that. The principal balance is not the payoff. So you have a lot of sellers that'll think, that's usually where people are off on their net sheets, because the sellers see the principal balance and they think that's what their payoff is. I would always pad that by a couple grand. So anyway, but that's the promissory note. And then your truth in lending, the biggest thing on this one to look at is, I'm going to go through the big picture. Basically, this APR right here, this annual percentage rate, it's always going to be a little bit higher than the note rate. And that's because this is a cost rate. It's basically the buyer's note rate plus closing costs to show in a rate format what it's costing to get the loan. So that's always going to be a little bit higher. It alarms some people, but we'll go through that at the closing. It's always going to be higher. The three big things you want to look for in this form. You want to make sure that they don't have a balloon feature. You want to make, which means like the payment could come due in like 5 years or 7 years. You want to make sure there's not an adjustable rate feature, or if there is, that they're aware of it, you know, where the promissory note interest rate can start adjusting. And you want to make sure that they don't have a prepayment penalty. Those are really the three big things you're looking for on this form, and they have to be disclosed on this form. So, and we go through that too, but the buyer should have that. The information for affidavit of heirship, this is important because we see more and more of this. If you have a seller who's an estate, you have a seller that you're working with, it's a deceased person, or someone has died, unfortunately, maybe that you're working with a widow or a widower, and their husband or wife has died. This is a common form that has to be completed. And this is because, again, because we're a joint property state in Texas, you have the wife's interest, and then you have her husband's interest. And if the husband or wife is deceased, you have that estate's interest. Not always the same interest as the wife, you know. This could be the fifth marriage, you know, it could be different. So what happens is the estates, the heirs, all have to fill out this document. And it's very lengthy, it's 6 pages. It's huge. So if you know that you're dealing with an estate,